The sun rose over the metal mountains of New Seoul and cast long shadows across the endless piles of twisted alien wreckage that stretched beyond the horizon. Hana wiped sweat from her forehead as she climbed over a chunk of purple metal that was twice her height. Her worn boots found grip on the smooth surface, even though it looked like glass. The metal felt warm under her touch, which was strange because the morning air was still cold. She had been working in the scrap yards since she was 12 years old, and now at 19, she knew these metal mountains better than anyone else could. The other workers called her the Ghost Girl because she could find valuable pieces in places where others saw only junk. Her grandmother, Mira, had taught her the secret of looking beyond what eyes could see. There was always something hidden, waiting for the right person to discover it. Hana carried her rusty sword strapped across her back, and the other scrap hunters often made jokes about it. The blade looked like someone had hammered it together from old car parts and forgotten to clean off the rust. It was ugly and crude compared to the shiny energy weapons that most people carried these days. Even the poorest workers could afford a basic blaster from the alien markets, but Hana refused to trade her sword for anything. The morning shift was just beginning when loud voices echoed across the metal yard. Hana looked up from the hole she was digging through and saw a group of alien traders walking between the scrap piles. Their skins shimmered with different colors, and they wore expensive clothes that seemed to float around their bodies instead of hanging normally. These were the merchants who came down from the floating cities above the clouds to buy rare metals from the human workers. Behind the aliens walked Dee, the yard supervisor, who was nodding and smiling too much the way he always did when important visitors came around. His face was red and sweaty as he tried to keep up with their long legs. The aliens moved with smooth grace that made humans look clumsy by comparison. Their technology allowed them to glide over rough ground, while humans had to climb and stumble. One of the aliens pointed at Hana and said something in their musical language that sounded like wind chimes. The others turned to look at her, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks. She was covered in metal dust and grease stains, while they looked perfect and clean. The alien, who had pointed at her, was tall and thin with blue skin that had silver patterns flowing across it like liquid metal. Day hurried over to where Hana was standing, and his voice was nervous when he spoke to her. The aliens wanted to see what she was carrying on her back. Because they found it interesting, Hana did not want to show them her sword, but Day gave her a look that said she had no choice if she wanted to keep her job. She pulled the rusty blade from its leather sheath and held it up for them. To see the weapon looked even worse in the bright morning light. The metal was covered with orange and brown rust that flaked off when she moved it. The handle was wrapped with old cloth that had turned gray from years of use. The blade itself was thick and heavy, like something a blacksmith might make if he had never seen a real sword before. The aliens stared at the weapon for a long moment, and then one of them made a sound like bubbles popping. The others joined in, and Hana realized they were laughing at her. The blue-skinned alien said something to Day in perfect human language about primitive craftsmanship and how amusing it was to see humans still making tools by hand. More aliens gathered around to look at the sword, and they began taking pictures with devices that floated in the air around them. One of them offered to buy the weapon from Hana for 5 credits, which was barely enough to buy a meal. He said it would make a wonderful conversation piece for his collection of primitive artifacts. The laughter grew louder, and other human workers stopped what they were doing to watch the show. Hana felt her face burning with shame as the aliens passed her sword around between them. They handled it carefully as if it might break from their touch and made comments about how crude human metalwork had become since they lost access to advanced technology. Hana snatched her sword back from them and shoved it into its sheath. Her hands were shaking with anger and embarrassment. The aliens seemed surprised by her reaction, and the blue-skinned one said something about humans being sensitive about their limitations. Day quickly apologized to them and assured them that Hana meant no disrespect, as the alien traders moved on to examine other parts of the scrapyard. Hana climbed down into a deep hole between two crashed ship hulls. She wanted to be alone and away from their mocking voices. The hole was dark and cool and filled with the smell of old metal and rust. She sat on a piece of broken machinery and tried not to cry. Her grandmother Mira found her there an hour later. The old woman moved slowly, but her eyes were still sharp despite her 80 years. She lowered herself down into the hole with Hana and sat beside her granddaughter without saying anything for a while. The silence between them was comfortable the way it always was. Finally, Mira spoke, and her voice was soft but serious. She told Hana that the aliens did not understand what they were looking at when they saw her sword. They saw only rust and crude metalwork, because that was all their advanced minds could comprehend. But there were things in this world that could not be measured by their instruments or explained by their science. Mira had never told anyone the full story of how Hana got her sword, but now she decided it was time. The weapon had been in their family for 50 years, ever since the first alien invasion fleet crashed into Earth. Her own father had found something special in the wreckage of the largest ship, something that the aliens themselves did not understand or recognize. The old woman reached into her jacket and pulled out a small piece of metal that gleamed with an inner light. It looked similar to the rust on Hana's sword, but when the light hit it just right. Strange patterns seemed to move beneath its surface. Mira explained that this was a fragment from the flagship of the invasion fleet, and that Hana's sword contained larger pieces of the same material. According to Mira, the flagship had been more than just a warship. It had been something called a reality render, a vessel that could change the laws of physics in the space around it. When it crashed, its hull scattered across the impact zone, and humans unknowingly built their city using fragments of its advanced technology. Hana listened to her grandmother's story with growing amazement and disbelief. It sounded like something from the old science fiction movies that people used to watch before the aliens came. But as Mira talked, she began to remember strange things about her sword, the way it sometimes felt lighter than air when she swung it, or how it never seemed to get dull, no matter how much she used it. The old woman stood up slowly and told Hana to test her weapon on the metal wall beside them. Hana was reluctant to try because the wall was made of the same alien hull material that could stop tank shells. But Mira insisted, so she drew her rusty sword and gave it a light tap against the purple metal. To her shock, the blade sank into the wall like it was soft clay. Instead of the loud clang she expected, there was only a soft whisper as the metal parted around her sword. She pulled it back out and stared at the clean cut that went 3 inches deep into material that should have been impossible to damage. Mira smiled at her granddaughter's expression and patted her shoulder. The aliens could laugh all they wanted at what they thought was primitive, human craftsmanship. But they had no idea that the rusty old sword they mocked was made from the most advanced technology their species had ever created. The irony was perfect, and someday they would learn the truth about what they had dismissed so easily. News traveled fast through the underground tunnels beneath New Seoul, and within 3 days, everyone in the lower city had heard about the girl. With the impossible sword, Hana tried to keep working in the scrapyards as usual, but people kept staring at her and whispering when they thought she could not hear them. Some asked to see her weapon cut through metal again, while others just wanted to touch the rusty blade that could do impossible things. Jin found her on the 4th day while she was sorting through a pile of broken alien computers. The former soldier was a big man with scars across his face and arms that told stories of the early resistance fights. He ran the underground fighting circuits where humans could bet on combat matches. That the alien government pretended not to know about his dark eyes studied Hana carefully as he approached her workstation. He told her about the gladiator arenas that the aliens had built for their entertainment. different species from across the galaxy came to fight each other, using whatever weapons and abilities they possessed. The crowds loved to watch exotic combat styles, and the prize money could be enough to buy passage off Earth for an entire family. Most humans who entered the arena died quickly because they lacked the natural advantages that other species had evolved over millions of years. Jin explained that he had been watching her demonstrate her sword to curious workers, and he believed she might have a real chance to win some matches. The weapon clearly had properties that defied normal physics, and that could give her the edge she needed against opponents who were stronger and faster than any human. But he warned her that the competition would be deadly, and that many fighters never left the arena alive. Hana was not sure she wanted to risk her life for money, but Jin told her about the other benefits of arena fighting. Winners became celebrities across the galaxy and gained access to technology and resources that ordinary humans could never obtain. Some successful gladiators had even been granted citizenship in the galactic government, which meant they could travel freely between worlds and live in the floating cities above Earth. That night, Hana talked to her grandmother about Jin offer, and Mira was strongly against the idea. She said that using the sword in public would draw dangerous attention from people who might recognize what it really was. The alien government had spent 50 years making sure that humans never learned the truth about the crashed invasion fleet, and they would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened that secret. But Hana had been thinking about their situation and how they lived like rats in the ruins, while aliens enjoyed lives of luxury and comfort. Her grandmother was getting old and needed medical treatment that they could never afford on scrapyard wages. The arena might be dangerous, but it also represented the only chance they had to change their circumstances. After 3 days of arguing, Hana made her decision and signed up for the next fighting tournament. Jin helped her register under a false name and arranged for basic medical coverage in case she survived her matches. The arena staff were amused by another human volunteer, since most of their fighters were exotic aliens with natural weapons or advanced technology. The arena was built inside a massive crater left by one of the crashed warships and could hold 50,000 spectators. The fighting pit was surrounded by energy barriers that could stop any weapon from reaching the crowd. Above the arena floated viewing boxes where wealthy aliens watched the matches while dining on expensive foods from there. Homeworld's Hana first opponent was announced as Cruel, a warrior from the Draxon system who had won 12 consecutive matches. His species looked like giant lizards covered in natural armor that could deflect most weapons their claws could tear through steel, and their bite delivered venom that paralyzed victims within seconds. Cruel stood nearly 8 feet tall, and his green scales reflected the arena lights like polished metal. The crowd was buzzing with excitement as they placed their bets, and most of the money was going on Cruel to win within the first minute. Even other humans in the cheaper seats were shaking their heads sadly at the sight of the small girl with her crude-looking sword facing such a formidable opponent. The betting odds were posted on screens around the arena and showed that Hana had almost no chance of survival. When the match began, Cruel moved with surprising speed for such a large creature. His powerful legs launched him across the arena floor, and his claws extended like razors as he dove toward Hana. She barely had time to draw her sword before he was on top of her, slashing at her chest with enough force to cut through metal armor. The crowd gasped as Cruel claws raked across Hana's body, but instead of blood spraying everywhere, there was only a shower of sparks as his natural weapons hit some kind of invisible barrier. The energy field around her glowed briefly before fading back to transparency, and Cruel stumbled backward in confusion. His claws should have torn her apart, but it was like hitting solid steel. Hana swung her rusty sword in a wide arc, and the blade passed through Cruel armor as if it was not even there. The crowd went silent as they watched the impossible sight of a primitive human weapon cutting through protection that could stop plasma cannons. The sword left a thin line across the alien warrior chest, but instead of bleeding, the wound glowed with strange energy before sealing itself. "Shut!" Cruel roared in. anger and breathed a stream of acid that could melt through starship hulls. But when the deadly spray hit Hana's sword, the blade absorbed the energy and redirected it back at him. The reflected acid struck his own armor and began eating through the scales he had trusted to protect him. For the first time in his fighting career, Krul felt fear as he faced an opponent whose weapons made no sense. The alien warrior tried every attack he knew, but nothing worked against the human girl. Her sword cut through his natural armor like paper, while her body remained protected by barriers that appeared from nowhere. When he tried to grab her with his massive hands, the invisible field around her delivered electric shocks that made his muscles spasm uncontrollably. The match lasted 15 minutes before Krul collapsed from exhaustion and shock. He was not seriously injured, but his confidence was completely shattered. The crowd sat in stunned silence as they tried to understand what they had witnessed. A primitive human had defeated one of the arena's most successful fighters using a weapon that looked like it belonged in a museum. Hana raised her sword above her head in victory, and the crowd finally erupted in cheers and boos. The aliens who had bet against her were angry and confused, while the few humans who had supported her were celebrating wildly. But Hana noticed that some of the wealthy aliens in the viewing boxes were not cheering or booing. Instead, they were speaking urgently into communication devices, and their faces showed concern rather than entertainment. As she left the arena that night, Hana felt proud of her victory but also worried about what would come next. Her grandmother had been right about drawing dangerous attention, and she could see alien security guards following her through the crowds. The rusty sword had proven its power, but now she would have to deal with the consequences of revealing abilities that were supposed to remain hidden. Jin met her outside the arena entrance, and his expression was serious rather than celebratory. He told her that representatives from the galactic government had been asking questions about her weapon and her background. They wanted to know where she had obtained technology that could defy their understanding of physics. The next few days would determine whether her arena victory had been worth the risk. Dr. Park had worked for the Galactic Council for 15 years and thought he had seen every type of technology in the known galaxy, but the rusty sword lying on his examination table made no sense according to any scientific principles he understood. The alien officials had ordered him to analyze the weapon that had defeated Krul in the arena and determine how a primitive human tool could perform impossible feats. His laboratory was filled with the most advanced scanning equipment that galactic science could provide: quantum analyzers that could examine matter at the subatomic level, energy detectors that could measure forces across 17 different dimensions, molecular printers that could recreate any substance once its composition was understood. Yet every test he ran on the sword produced results that contradicted each other. The basic metal composition appeared to be simple iron mixed with common elements found in any scrap yard. But when he looked closer, strange patterns emerged in the atomic structure that seemed to shift and change when he was not watching directly. The quantum scanner showed readings that made his eyes water to look at and suggested the metal existed in multiple dimensions. Simultaneously, Park tried to take samples from the blade, but his cutting tools could not scratch its surface. Even industrial lasers that could slice through starship armor had no effect on the rusty metal. When he attempted to use matter transporters to remove small pieces, the equipment simply refused to function, as if the sword was rejecting any attempt to analyze it properly. Meanwhile, Hana continued fighting in the arena, and each victory became more spectacular than the last. She faced energy beings that could phase through solid matter and cut them apart with her blade. She blocked weapons that operated outside normal space-time and reflected their attacks back at opponents. Her protective barrier grew stronger with each fight, until even plasma cannons could not penetrate it. Word of the impossible human fighter spread throughout the galaxy, and aliens from distant worlds traveled to Earth just to witness her matches. Some came as entertainment seekers wanting to see the novelty of a primitive species using mysterious technology. Others arrived as researchers trying to understand how human weapons could defy galactic science. Sue worked in the council archives during the night shift, when few people were around to monitor what files she accessed. The young hacker had grown curious about Earth history after hearing stories about Hana's sword and decided to investigate the official records about the alien invasion 50 years ago. She expected to find routine military reports about technical failures and navigation errors. Instead, she discovered layers of classified information that had been hidden from the public for decades. The surface files told the standard story about how the invasion fleet suffered mechanical breakdowns and crashed into Earth due to equipment malfunctions, but deeper in the archives, she found reports that painted a very different picture of what had really happened. The invasion force had been the most advanced military fleet ever assembled with technology that could rewrite the laws of physics in local space. Their flagship was called the Reality Render and possessed weapons that could destroy entire planets by making their gravity reverse or their atomic bonds dissolve. The fleet commander had expected to conquer Earth within hours using overwhelming technological superiority. But something had gone wrong from the moment they entered Earth. Atmosphere human fighters using crude metal weapons had somehow damaged ships that were protected by energy shields capable of stopping supernovas. Primitive missiles built from scrap metal had penetrated armor that could deflect black hole radiation. Infantry, with simple guns, had survived direct hits from weapons that could vaporize mountains. Deeper, Sue dug into the classified files, the more impossible the reports became. Human technology that should have been useless against galactic science had proven devastatingly effective. The invasion fleet had not crashed due to mechanical failure, but had been shot down by defenders whose weapons operated according to different physical laws than the rest of the universe. She found the final classified report buried in the deepest security levels, and it contained information that made her hands shake as she read it. The reality render had not been destroyed when it crashed, but had scattered itself across the impact zone in billions of microscopic fragments. Every piece of metal in New Sol contained traces of the flagship advanced technology that could manipulate reality itself. The report explained that humans had unknowingly built their entire city using fragments of the most advanced warship ever created. Every building, every vehicle, every tool contained pieces of technology that existed beyond normal physics. The invasion fleet had not been defeated by human weapons, but by their own flagship, which had somehow turned against them during the battle. According to the final analysis, humans had been slowly integrating with reality render technology for 50 years without realizing it. Their bodies had adapted to exposure to fragments that existed in multiple dimensions. Their tools had evolved to channel forces that could rewrite local physics. Their entire species was becoming something that galactic science could not understand or control. Sue copied the files to a secure storage device and made her way through the empty corridors toward the exit. But alarms began sounding throughout the building and security. Lights bathed the hallways in red emergency protocols activated automatically, and blast doors sealed off all the exits. She had been detected accessing files that were classified beyond her clearance level. Armed guards surrounded her before she could reach the main entrance, and their leader was a tall alien with gray skin and black eyes that seemed to look right through her. He spoke in perfect human language, and his voice was cold as winter ice. He told her that stealing classified information was punishable by memory erasure and permanent exile from Earth. But as the guards reached for her, something strange happened. The walls around them began to glow with a faint light, and the metal floor started vibrating with harmonic frequencies. Sue realized that her fear and desperation were somehow activating the reality render fragments embedded in the building structure. The architecture itself was responding to her emotional state. The guard stepped backward in alarm as the corridor began reshaping itself around them. What had been a straight hallway now curved in impossible directions, and doorways appeared where there had been solid walls. The building was becoming a maze that defied three-dimensional geometry and the aliens found themselves lost in a structure they had thought they understood. Sue ran through passages that formed themselves ahead of her and disappeared behind her as she passed. The stolen files in her hands felt warm and seemed to pulse with their own energy. She could hear the guards shouting in confusion as they tried to navigate corridors that no longer obeyed normal physics. Their advanced technology was useless in a building that could rewrite its own blueprint in real time. When she finally emerged into the street outside, Sue looked back to see the council archive building flickering between different architectural styles as if it could not decide what shape it wanted to maintain. The guards were still trapped inside a maze that existed in more dimensions than their minds could process. She knew that everything had changed now. The secret was out, and soon the entire galaxy would learn that Earth was not a conquered world, but a massive alien weapon that had been growing. Stronger for 50 years, every human on the planet carried fragments of technology that could reshape reality, and they were only just beginning to understand their true potential. The emergency session of the Galactic Council lasted 3 days and nights, as representatives from across the galaxy debated what to do about the Earth situation. The stolen files that Sue had released to the public networks had caused panic throughout civilized space. Every species now knew that humans possessed fragments of the reality render and were becoming capable of rewriting the laws of physics. Commander Zek stood before the council chamber wearing the black armor of the Void Hunters, and his pale blue skin seemed to glow under the harsh lights. His species had evolved in the darkness between stars and possessed natural abilities that made them perfect for hunting threats that normal military forces could not handle. The Council had summoned him because regular soldiers would be useless against enemies who could ignore the rules of reality. The commander listened to the debate with growing impatience as politicians argued about diplomatic solutions and economic sanctions. Against Earth, they did not understand that humans were no longer a primitive species that could be controlled through conventional means. The reality render fragments had been changing them for 50 years, and now they represented an existential threat to galactic civilization. Zek had studied the arena footage of Hana battles and analyzed the reports from Dr. Park Laboratory. The human girl was just the beginning of something much larger. Every person on Earth carried the same fragments in their bodies and tools, which meant 8 billion potential reality shapers were living on a single world. The implications terrified even the Void Hunters who had faced cosmic horrors that drove other species insane. When the Council finally authorized extreme measures, Zek assembled his best hunters from across the galaxy. They were beings who had been trained since birth to fight impossible enemies, using weapons and techniques that operated outside normal space-time. Each hunter carried equipment specifically designed to counteract reality-warping technology, and their minds had been conditioned to resist mental attacks that could rewrite memory and perception. The Void Hunter fleet arrived at Earth within hours of receiving their orders and immediately began deploying containment fields around the planet. These energy barriers were designed to prevent any human from leaving the solar system until the threat could be eliminated. Zek knew that if even one reality shaper escaped into galactic space, the contamination could spread to other worlds. But as soon as the containment fields activated, strange things began happening throughout the human cities. Buildings that had stood unchanged for decades suddenly started shifting and growing as if they were alive. Streets rearranged themselves into patterns that hurt to look at directly, and the sky above major population centers began showing colors that did not exist in normal physics. Hana was training in the arena when the alarms started sounding throughout New Seoul. She could feel something wrong in the air around her, as if the very atoms were vibrating with tension. The other fighters seemed confused and nervous, but she recognized the sensation from her battles. It was the feeling she got when her sword was about to do something impossible. Jin burst into the training area and told her that alien warships had surrounded the planet and were preparing for some kind of military action. The news networks were reporting that the Galactic Council had declared Earth a threat to universal stability and authorized the use of extreme force to contain the situation. Humans throughout the city were being ordered to surrender any weapons or tools that contained alien materials. Hana realized that her arena victories had triggered this crisis by revealing the truth about human capabilities. She felt guilty for putting her entire species in danger, but Mira reminded her that the secret would have come out. Eventually, the reality render fragments were becoming more active as humans learned to use them, and soon everyone on Earth would have been displaying impossible abilities. The first void. Hunter strike teams landed in the scrap yards outside New Sol using ships that could phase in and out of normal space. Their black armor made them almost invisible against the twisted metal landscape, and their weapons fired energy beams that could disrupt matter at the quantum level. These were not ordinary soldiers, but specialists trained to eliminate threats that conventional forces could not handle. Hana found herself being hunted through the metal mountains where she had worked since childhood. But now the familiar landscape was changing around her as her fear and desperation activated the reality render fragments embedded in every piece of wreckage. The metal itself seemed to be helping her escape by creating passages and hiding places where none had existed before. The Void Hunters quickly discovered that their advanced technology was not as effective as they had expected against an environment that could rewrite its own physical laws. Their quantum disruptors worked perfectly in normal space, but became unreliable when reality itself was unstable. Their phase shifters allowed them to pass through solid matter until the matter decided to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Dong had been a maintenance worker for 20 years and thought he understood every pipe and wire in the city infrastructure. But when the invasion began, his simple tools started doing impossible things. His wrench could now adjust bolts that existed in parallel dimensions, and his welding torch could cut holes through space-time itself. He realized that the building he had been maintaining was actually a single massive organism built from reality render fragments. Yuki worked construction and had always prided herself on building things that would last forever. But now the concrete she poured could reshape itself, and the steel beams she welded could grow like living tissue. The city was awakening around her as millions of humans unconsciously activated technology they had never known they possessed. Throughout New Sol, similar awakenings were happening as ordinary people discovered extraordinary abilities. Teachers found they could share knowledge directly from mind to mind. Doctors learned that their instruments could diagnose conditions that did not exist in normal biology. Farmers realized their crops could grow in minutes and survive in environments that should have been lethal. The Void Hunters had expected to face one enhanced human with a mysterious weapon, but instead found themselves fighting an entire population that was transforming in real time. Every human they encountered displayed different reality-shaping abilities, and the very ground beneath their feet was becoming hostile to their presence. Their mission parameters had not prepared them. For a planet-wide awakening, Commander Zek established his command post on one of the orbiting warships and watched in growing alarm as his hunter teams reported impossible situations from the surface buildings were reshaping themselves to trap his soldiers in maze-like structures that existed in more than 3 dimensions. Streets were becoming rivers of liquid metal that flowed uphill against gravity. The weather patterns were moving with strategic intelligence, as if the planet itself had become sentient. The commander realized that they were not facing a human rebellion using stolen alien technology, but something far more dangerous. Earth had become a massive reality render that was crewed by 8 billion beings who were just beginning to understand their potential. The crashed flagship had not died 50 years ago, but had scattered itself across the planet and spent decades slowly converting the entire human species. His tactical analysis showed that conventional military force would be useless against an enemy that could selectively ignore the laws of physics. The humans were not using technology in the traditional sense, but had become technology itself. Their tools and weapons were extensions of their will, rather, than separate devices, and their cities were living organisms that responded to collective human consciousness. Zek sent an urgent message to the Galactic Council, reporting that the Earth situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. The humans were not primitive beings who had found some alien artifacts, but had evolved into something entirely new that could threaten the stability of the entire universe. If they were allowed to spread beyond their solar system, they could potentially remake galactic civilization according to their own incomprehensible physics. But even as he composed his report, the commander could see that it might already be too late. Human ships were launching from the planet's surface using technology that should not have been able to function. They were crude vessels built from city infrastructure that had reshaped itself into spacecraft, but they moved through space with impossible speed and agility. The containment fields that were supposed to trap humans on Earth began failing as reality shapers learned to manipulate the energy barriers. The fleet that had come to eliminate a primitive threat now found itself facing an enemy that was rapidly becoming more powerful than anything the galaxy had ever encountered. The orbital bombardment began at dawn when the Galactic Council fleet opened fire with weapons capable of cracking planets in half-energy beams that could vaporize mountains, struck the major human cities, while kinetic projectiles traveling at near light-speed targeted population centers. The aliens had decided that complete extermination was the only way to prevent the human threat from spreading beyond Earth. But the planet fought back in ways that defied every principle of military science. The atmosphere itself became a defensive barrier that absorbed incoming energy and redirected it harmlessly into space. Gravity wells appeared around the kinetic projectiles and slowed them to a gentle stop before they could impact the surface. Weather patterns moved with strategic intelligence to place cloud cover exactly where it was needed. Hana stood on the roof of a building in New Seoul and watched alien warships burn in the sky above her. The city around her had transformed into something that belonged in a dream or nightmare. Streets flowed like rivers of liquid metal, while buildings grew and twisted into impossible shapes that hurt to look at directly. Her rusty sword felt warm in her hands and seemed to pulse with energy that matched her heartbeat. The weapon had changed during the past few hours and no longer looked like crude human metalwork. Instead, it appeared to be made from crystallized starlight that shifted between dimensions as she moved it. The blade could now cut through space itself, and she had learned to strike targets on distant ships without leaving the planet's surface. Distance had become meaningless when reality bent to accommodate her will. Throughout the city, other humans were discovering similar transformations in their tools and abilities. Tae had been a simple farmer, but now his crops could grow in minutes and survive in the vacuum of space. His plants spread beyond Earth atmosphere and began forming a protective shield around the planet using roots that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Rena worked as a school teacher and had always been good at explaining difficult concepts to children, but now she could share knowledge instantly across vast distances, and her students included people from around the globe who learned directly from her consciousness. Her classroom had become a network that connected human minds and allowed them to coordinate their reality-shaping abilities. The human fighters who took to space rode in vessels that should never have been able to fly. Their ships were built from chunks of city infrastructure that had reshaped itself according to their needs and desires. These craft looked like abstract sculptures made from twisted metal and living crystal, but they proved devastatingly effective against the alien fleet commander. Zek watched in horror as his most advanced warships were destroyed by enemies whose technology made no logical sense. Human fighters flew through his energy barriers as if they did not exist, and their weapons ignored defensive shields that could stop black hole radiation. His quantum torpedoes simply disappeared when they got close to human ships, as if reality was editing them out. Of existence, the Void Hunters, who had been deployed to the planet's surface, found themselves trapped in cities that had become hostile to their presence. Buildings rearranged themselves to create mazes that existed in more than 3 dimensions. Streets became flowing rivers of metal that carried intruders away from their objectives. The very air seemed thick and resistant to their movements. Some hunters reported that their equipment was malfunctioning in impossible ways. Their phase shifters would activate randomly and trap them partially inside solid walls. Their quantum disruptors began targeting their own weapons instead of enemy combatants. Their communication devices started broadcasting human thoughts and emotions instead of tactical. Information Zek realized that his forces were not just fighting humans, but were engaged in combat with the planet itself. Earth had become a single massive organism that could manipulate matter and energy according to its collective will. Every human on the surface was connected to this planetary consciousness and could channel its power to reshape local reality. The tide of battle turned completely when more humans joined the fight. Each person who awakened to their true nature added exponentially to Earth's collective abilities. The planet began moving under its own power and no longer followed the orbital mechanics that had governed it for billions of years. It became a mobile fortress that could appear anywhere in the solar system instantly. Human ships swarmed around the alien fleet like angry insects, and their attacks became increasingly creative and impossible. Some fired weapons that traveled backward through time to strike targets before the triggers were pulled. Others launched projectiles that existed in multiple locations simultaneously and could hit the same enemy from several directions at once. The aliens found that their advanced tactics and strategic doctrines were useless against enemies who could rewrite the rules of engagement in real time. Human fighters would disappear from one location and reappear behind enemy lines without crossing the space between battles took place across multiple dimensions simultaneously as reality shapers learned. To fight in more than 3 spatial dimensions, Dr. Park watched the space battle from his laboratory and tried to understand what was happening to his own equipment. Every instrument in his facility had begun displaying readings that contradicted known physics. His quantum scanners showed human ships existing in 17 dimensions simultaneously, while his energy detectors registered power sources that operated on principles beyond galactic science. The human awakening was accelerating as more people realized their potential and joined the collective consciousness that was reshaping Earth. Children who had been playing with toys made from alien scrap suddenly found themselves controlling defensive systems that protected entire cities. Elderly people who had lived through the invasion discovered that their memories contained access codes for reality, render technology. Sue found herself at the center of a growing information network that connected human minds across the planet. The stolen files she had released were no longer just data, but had become living information that could teach people how to use their reality-shaping abilities. Her consciousness had merged with the planetary database, and she could access any knowledge that any human had ever learned. The galactic fleet began retreating as their losses mounted beyond acceptable levels. Commander Zek ordered a fighting withdrawal, but discovered that his ships could no longer leave the solar system. Human reality shapers had somehow altered space-time to create a gravity well that trapped anything trying to escape. The aliens who had come to contain Earth now found themselves imprisoned by their intended victims. The planet pursued the retreating fleet through space. Using movement that defied every law of orbital mechanics, Earth could now accelerate instantly to any speed and change direction without regard for momentum or conservation of energy. The alien ships that had seemed so powerful and advanced were helpless against an enemy that could ignore the fundamental forces of the universe. As the battle raged across the solar system, more alien reinforcements arrived from distant worlds, but they found themselves facing an enemy that was growing stronger with each passing hour. The human collective consciousness was learning to use reality render technology more effectively, and their abilities were expanding beyond anything the galaxy had ever encountered. The Awakening War had begun, and humanity was no longer the conquered primitive species that aliens remembered. Instead, they had become something entirely new that could potentially remake the entire universe according to their own incomprehensible vision of how reality should function. The galaxy would never be the same again. The galactic fleet retreated in complete disorder as Earth pursued them across the solar system like an angry god. The planet moved through space with impossible grace, ignoring the laws of physics that had governed celestial motion since the beginning of time. Alien warships that had once seemed invincible were destroyed by weapons that operated according to principles beyond any known science. Commander Zek found his flagship surrounded by human fighters whose ships defied every tactical analysis. His computers could produce. They moved in formations that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously and fired weapons that could strike through time itself. His defensive systems were useless against enemies who could rewrite the rules of combat in real time. The Galactic Council received his desperate reports with growing terror, as they realized that humanity was no longer a containable threat, but had become something that could potentially destroy their entire civilization. The reality render fragments had not just enhanced human abilities, but had fundamentally transformed the species into beings who existed beyond normal physics. Emergency sessions convened across the galaxy as representatives from hundreds of worlds debated whether to continue fighting or attempt negotiations with the transformed humans. Some argued for deploying planet-killing weapons before Earth could spread beyond the solar system, while others insisted that diplomatic contact might be their only chance of survival. But the decision was taken out of their hands when Earth appeared in orbit around the galactic capital. Without warning, the planet had somehow traveled across thousands of light-years in an instant and now hung in space like a blue-green moon above the administrative world, where the council met. The sight of a mobile planet caused panic throughout the system. As alien ships fled in terror, Hana stood in what had once been the arena where she first revealed her abilities, but the structure had transformed into something that resembled a crystalline cathedral built from living starlight. She could feel the consciousness of every human on Earth flowing through her mind, and understood that she had somehow become their representative in the negotiations that would determine the future of galactic civilization. Her rusty sword had evolved beyond physical form and now existed as pure will made manifest. The weapon could cut through dimensions and slice apart the fundamental forces that held reality together. But more importantly, it had become a symbol of humanity. Transformation from a conquered species into something that transcended normal existence. The alien delegation that came to meet her included representatives from every major species in the galaxy. They traveled in ships protected by the most advanced defensive systems ever created, but their technology seemed primitive compared to the reality-shaping abilities that surrounded them on all sides. The very space around Earth seemed alive with possibilities. Ambassador Vel spoke for the galactic government, and her crystalline body reflected light in patterns that indicated extreme nervousness. She had been chosen for this meeting because her species were natural diplomats who could communicate with beings whose thought processes were completely alien, but nothing in her training had prepared her for negotiations with entities who could rewrite the laws of physics. Began with the standard diplomatic protocols, and offered humanity a place in the galactic community as equals rather than subjects. But Hana explained that humans were no longer interested in joining existing structures because they had evolved. Beyond the need for traditional government or technology, their society had become something entirely new. The negotiations revealed the fundamental problem facing both species. Humanity had transcended the physical limitations that defined galactic civilization, while the aliens remained bound by laws of science that humans could now ignore. The gap between them was not just technological, but existential, as they had become different kinds of beings entirely. Hana tried to explain what humanity had become, but found that words were inadequate for describing their transformation. They were no longer individuals using tools, but had merged with technology to become living extensions of the reality render. Their consciousness existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, and their bodies could reshape matter through will alone. The aliens struggled to understand how an entire species could evolve so rapidly, but Hana showed them recordings from the past 50 years that revealed the gradual process of integration. Every generation of humans had been slightly more adapted to reality render technology than the previous one until the awakening finally triggered their complete transformation. Some alien species decided to adapt to this new reality and began forming partnerships with human colonies that spread across the galaxy. These cooperative settlements became centers of impossible science, where beings could experiment with technologies that operated beyond normal. Physics children grew up learning to manipulate matter at the atomic level. While their alien friends watched in wonder, other species chose to retreat to distant regions of the galaxy and established isolation zones where they could continue living. According to traditional physics, these refuge worlds maintained the old ways of science and technology while carefully avoiding contact with reality shapers who might accidentally contaminate their local space-time. The negotiations established new protocols for interaction between transformed humans and traditional aliens. Most importantly, they created buffer zones where both types of beings could meet safely without risk of reality contamination spreading to species who were not ready for transformation. Hana returned to what had once been New Seoul, but the city now existed in a state of constant fluid change. Buildings flowed like living organisms that reshaped themselves according to their inhabitants' needs. Streets became streams of liquid light that could carry people instantly to any destination. The sky showed colors that had no names because they existed beyond normal electromagnetic spectrum. Children played games that involved manipulating gravity and creating pocket universes while their parents worked at jobs that would have seemed like magic to previous generations. Farmers grew crops in soil made from condensed starlight, while engineers built machines that operated on principles of wishful thinking rather than mechanical force. Mira had lived to see her granddaughter become the champion of humanity-transformed species and spent her final years teaching children how to use reality-shaping abilities responsibly. She understood that great power required great wisdom and worked to ensure that future generations would use their abilities to create rather than destroy. The metal yards where Hana had once searched for scrap had become gardens where plants with crystalline leaves grew from soil that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The twisted wreckage of alien warships had transformed into art installations that told the story of humanity evolution from conquered primitives to transcendent beings, looking back at their history. Humans finally understood why they had always been different from other galactic species. They had not been meant to use technology in conventional ways, but were designed to merge with their tools until the boundary between user and instrument disappeared completely. This was why their crude weapons had proven effective against advanced alien systems. The rusty sword that had started everything still existed, but now it was recognized as more than just a weapon. It had become a symbol of humanity journey from mockery to mastery, representing the truth that sometimes the most powerful tools are those that appear most humble. Appearance meant nothing when reality itself could be reshaped according to will and imagination across the galaxy. Alien archaeologists began searching for other reality render fragments, wondering if their own species might be capable of similar transformation. But they discovered that the fusion process required specific genetic and cultural characteristics that made humans uniquely compatible with the scattered flagship technology. The universe had been fundamentally changed by humanity, awakening as reality shapers spread throughout the galaxy, establishing colonies where impossible science became everyday routine. Trade routes developed between species who could manipulate matter through thought and those who still relied on conventional physics, creating a new galactic economy. Hana often stood in her crystalline cathedral and remembered the day when aliens had laughed at her rusty blade. Now those same species sent diplomats to negotiate with beings who could rewrite the fundamental constants of physics. The weapon they had dismissed as primitive scrap had revealed itself to be fragments of the most advanced technology ever created. Humanity had proven that true strength came from understanding rather than force, and that evolution could transform any species into something greater than their origins suggested. The galaxy would never again underestimate beings who could make miracles from determination and imagination, because they had learned that reality itself was just another tool waiting for the right hands to reshape it.